So this is a very different kind of talk. This is a rather more empirical talk. It's just going to be talking about the biogeography and avifauna of the same valley. So this is a shameless collection of photographs of birds and pretty landscapes. So my role in this is to write the project proposals and then put together a group of people to undertake the research. We don't spend all our time complaining about the administration of Peruvian universities whilst we're eating chupe de camarones. We do also do some work elsewhere in the valley, and one of the things I do is when I've been working on the bofedales, the Andean wetlands, or the relictual forests in the high Andes, is to collect data on the avifauna. And one of the points about this that I'm often asked is, well, why are you looking at this area? Most of the birds are in the Amazon. But actually, this is a region of Peru that is very little studied. Practically all the biologists with any interest in wildlife go to the Amazon. They don't stay on the Pacific slope. But actually, the Pacific slope is more interesting as far as I'm concerned. So this talk is going to be broken into, yes, a simple introduction, followed by a discussion of the avifaunal diversity in Peru, and then running through the natural regions in Peru very, very briefly, and then talking about the life zones in the Cañete Valley, and then quickly running through all the different areas of interest in the Cañete Valley, which is this area here, outlined in red. That's the Cañete Valley. It's about 6,500 square kilometres, so it's a very large area. And someone was asking me earlier how many times I'd been to Peru, and there's quite a few. But we visited the valley 14 times over 5 years, so since 2018-19. I had never been there before, but that 14 visits added up to about, I suppose in total, about 6 months in terms of overall time. And just to answer the question I was asked earlier this evening as to how many times John and I had been to Peru, we worked it out the other day. It's between 40 and 45 times since 1985. So we have been there quite a few times. I hadn't realised quite how many times, but more than I care to think. Anyway, so yes, avifaunal diversity in Peru. Well, most people who know anything about Peru will hear, oh yes, there's many, many species of birds in Peru, and indeed there are, because it is now level pegging with Colombia. Now they've removed Isla San Andres from the geographical boundaries of Colombia, and so they've had to take all their migratory birds off their list, and now Peru has the same number of species as Colombia. And of those, 117 are endemic, which means they're only found in Peru. And then, of course, everyone thinks, well, if you look at the map on the bottom left, it shows the red areas is where all the species are. But there might be lots of species there, but they're not endemic. They occur across the whole of the Amazon. Whereas in the Andean region, where there's roughly the same order of magnitude, many, many of them are only found in the Andes. So of the 117 endemic species, 104 are only found in the Andes. And then a further 9 in the desert. Whereas there's only 4 in the whole of the Amazon. So whilst the Amazon gets all the attention from the biologists, no one pays any attention really certainly to the desert, or really even to the Andes. I mean, well, we've been working in the Andes now since 2016. We never see any biologists. They're always in the airport on their way to Iquitos or Puerto Maldonado, which is fine. Anyway, so in the Cañete Valley, we found 270 species of birds. 23 of them are only really found in Peru, or have very restricted ranges. Of them, 17 are very, very restricted in their distribution in Peru. And in the Cañete Valley, we found 11 near-threatened species, 4 vulnerable species, which means they're on their way to extinction, 2 endangered species, which means they're only found in very, very small areas, and 1 critically endangered species. And one of those vulnerable species is the one top right, the Andean Condor, which is continuing its sad decline in Peru. So when it comes to thinking about Peru, the obvious point most people make is, well, it falls into 3 obvious regions. You have the rainforest, which is on the right, the bright green area, and that's where most biodiversity is found. You have the Andes in the middle and the desert along the coast. And a lot of people are interested in thinking about how Peru can be broken up into different sorts of regions, and one of the most famous is Copenhagen. He was a botanist, and he, using climatic data, divided Peru up into a series of regions with which he hoped to be able to determine the distribution of certain groups of plants or plant assemblages. And there are people from Kew at the back there probably groaning as I'm saying this, but so Peru broken up into these differing areas is in fact very useful from the point of view of looking at birds and avifaunal diversity, because a lot of birds tend to be restricted to certain of these zones identified by the Copenhagen climate model. So the arid desert, hot arid desert, or the cold arid desert separates the distributions of many different species. Likewise, of course, that very, very narrow band you can see here, which is called, unfortunately, it's called steppe, which is a Eurasian term, but anyway, this line here is very, very narrow, but it does, in fact, provide the distribution for many of those endemic species. More useful, though, is a system devised by BirdLife International, a very practical system, a system which was devised to try and protect biodiversity, not one based on climate data, one based on looking at areas which hold high levels of endemic species. And so looking at birds, which is one of the easiest groups to look at, an endemic bird area, here's one, this is the Tumbesian region, it has more than 2 species whose entire range lies within that area. And in fact, that line, the Tumbesian region, encompasses the entire range of, I think, about 35 species. So it becomes a very distinct region, and those species do not occur outside of it. Likewise, the Peru-Chile Pacific slope, it doesn't have anywhere near as many, but it has quite a number of species that only occur there. And in this map, you can see these orange delimited areas. This is called the Peruvian High Andes, and these provide or encompass the entire distribution of a significant number of the Peruvian endemic species. And then finally, the Junín Huancavelica puna, which includes most of the bofedales and wetlands that we're looking at in the Cañete Valley. Those too have species, most of them endangered, that only occur in those parts of Peru. So in the Cañete Valley, so moving on, you see the total area of the Cañete Valley is a little smaller than I said. That's because we also included a strip of land up here, up the side. So we looked at about 6,500 kilometres squared. And in that area, you have these endemic bird areas. The coastal area, the Peru-Chile slope here, so that's one endemic bird area. In the middle, you have the Peruvian High Andes, which are all the steep slopes. And then up here, you have the High Andes, which are all the bofedales, the ice fields, and the puna grasslands. So as you rise from the coast, obviously at sea level, by the time you get up to Yauyos, you're already at 3,500 metres, and it's only 80 kilometres inland. So the transition is very noticeable and very rapid as you go from desert with Lomas, the fog oases on the hills on the coast, through the arid scrub, which then grades up into cloud forests, and also polylepis at about 3,500 metres. So the habitat diversity in the valley is quite extraordinary. I mean, there's more variety in this one valley than there is in the whole of the UK in terms of habitat. And there's more birds in that one valley than in the whole of Britain. And the extent of natural primary habitat is far greater than exists in the whole of the UK. So if we just then run very quickly through all the different habitats that exist. So the desert on the Pacific slope is not just, as you might imagine, sand dunes and empty of wildlife. It's very varied in itself. You have, first of all, these fog oases, the Lomas, which change dramatically from year to year. You have this ephemeral vegetation, blooming of the desert, etc. And it can be quite an extraordinary transformation if you happen to go to Lomas de la Chai or Lomas de Asia to see the transformation of the landscape and all the flowers. And they are, all the Lomas, each one is very different in terms of the birds that are there and the plants as well. So this is one of the most interesting lowland habitats in Peru, on the coast. And then this is the desert in the more strict sense of the word, although this is probably still classified as a loma. This is Tillandsia latifolia, and they form these mats of vegetation out in, I suppose it's sort of transitional desert sort of habitat. And a lot of the vegetation in the desert is like Vachelia, which is used to be called acacia, and then quite a wide variety of plants, which you possibly wouldn't expect in a desert where it rarely rains. It is classified as, well, large areas are classified as hyper-arid, which means less than 10 millimetres a year. And that was certainly the case in Moquegua. So in the deserts, surprising variety of birds. You have in the middle at the top Cactus canistera that only lives on the Pacific slope, and it is always tied to where there are columnar cacti. A series of hummingbirds, they're quite common there. When the desert's flowering, of course, it's full of hummingbirds. That's in the middle at the front. And then when the desert's flowering, there are lots of rats and mice and lots of birds around. There are the owls and the raptors turn up, and the birds start breeding. And two species you can see breeding in large numbers at Lomas de la Chai and Lomas de Asia, the greyish miner, bottom right, and the seed snipe, top left. And then the nightjar, nocturnal bird, you can actually hear that calling in central Lima, nesting on people's roofs. But it's quite common throughout the desert. Also in the lowlands, so this is another habitat, and again this is the area where we were working on looking at the river shrimp. Of course the habitat there is very distinct, and it has its own avifauna. The rivers are lined with of willow and river cane, with some pepper trees, Shynus moye, and also some acacia as well. So most of the river valleys along the Pacific coast of Peru look somewhat like this. And in these vegetation, you have quite a lot of different birds. On the left there, here's the bird that likes football pitches, the Peruvian thick-knee. I think it's called waikeke, isn't it? You can hear it at night almost anywhere along the coast. It's very common. On the right, you have two species. Again, they're restricted to these coastal valleys where the vegetation lines the rivers. And so there are other birds, black-necked woodpeckers, and quite a lot of other species that only live in those river valleys. And of course, with the development of agriculture, they're quite threatened. A lot of the forest is being cleared, a lot of the land is being converted. But in the Cañete Valley, there's a significant area of protected forest, and this is because when there's an El Nino year, essentially the floodplain is unusable because the river can cut through and would destroy any agricultural land that's being developed. So they keep it as a protected area of forest because that will reduce flooding downstream, or so the story goes. The other habitat on the coast, which is very important, not just for the shrimp, you saw a picture of this earlier, this is the estuary, the Rio Cañete estuary, and this is not only one of the most important estuaries for the Andean river shrimp, but it is also one of the most important for migratory birds. And of course, with the number of shrimp that are there, the migratory birds come to feed on them. So in the northern winter, you can have 50,000-60,000 Franklin's gulls spending the whole winter there. And how the shrimp survive that, I can't imagine, but they do. And then there's usually pelicans and cormorants there and vast numbers of other birds. And so it's probably one of the single most important estuaries along the Peruvian coast for biodiversity in general. But it has no protection apart from the Commission for the Protection of the Camarones. Okay. There is no protection as there would be, say, for Pantanos de Villa or other wetlands along the coast. But it should be protected. Yeah, it's a very important estuary. So a few pictures of some birds. There's the Franklin's gulls. It doesn't look like there's 50,000 there, but there may well be underneath, sat on the bank. In the middle at the front, that's a favourite little bird there that's common in wetlands throughout Peru, and the pelican. And these birds are always there in good numbers. And bottom left is the Peruvian tern, which nests on sandy beaches, and it's now become critically endangered through the development of sandy beaches for holidaymakers, unfortunately. So that is disappearing quickly, but for the most part, the birds that depend upon the estuary are still in good health, population-wise. Moving up the valley, so we've now moved up to Huancayo and much higher. I don't know why all the pictures have kind of shrunk and sort of compressed. Anyway, not to worry. So as you move further up the valley, you're at about 3,000 metres. On the bottom left picture, that's the lakes above Huancayo. And then the river meadows here. These are quite common in the valley. They're not at all common in the valleys along the Pacific slope, these peaty river meadows. And these are exceptionally good for wildfowl and birds that come down during the austral winter to shelter from the weather, which can be fairly extreme. And elsewhere at that altitude you find, which you don't see again in very many valleys, you see the relictual cloud forests with all this Spanish moss hanging down from the trees, and it is quite stunningly beautiful. So it's very limited areas, but it is a sort of a cloud forest, which I'm sure most of you probably don't imagine it occurs just above the deserts on the coast of Peru, and there's extensive areas of it in the Cañete Valley. So along the rivers, because it is such a clean river, the number of this species, the torrent duck, is very, very high, which again, it's the only river that we know along the Pacific slope which has a good population of them. And so all these species here are very sensitive to water quality, and we had considered using the torrent duck as a bioindicator. But of course we couldn't go catching them and looking for the accumulation of trace metals. They might taste good as well, but there wouldn't be many ducks left after a while. Anyway, the population of them is remarkably high, and in fact there may be more in the Cañete Valley than there are in rivers on the east flank of the Andes where they're thought to be more numerous. This bird is very sensitive to any contamination at high Andean lakes, silvery grebe, and that would be well, it would disappear very quickly if there was any contamination from mining, for example. Andean geese, obviously, are common in the Cañete Valley, and along with a huge number of other wetland birds, because the water quality is generally unaffected by mining, whereas if you went to the Cordillera Waiwash or further south in Moquegua, the quality of water in the Andes is impacted by mining, and the population of these birds is much lower. The Cañete Valley, in spite of its proximity to Lima, has got very good populations of most of the birds that you would traditionally expect to see in the Andes. So moving up a little bit higher, this is something that Cañete Valley is famous for, the Andenes, which possibly gave name to the mountain range of the same name. These are the intensively terraced hill slopes, which really are throughout the valley, and they're not farmed very much these days, but pre-conquest they were undoubtedly farmed very intensively, and the populations of people living here would have been much higher than even it is today. So all those terraces would have been farmed to feed a significantly higher population. And of course, with the drainage and irrigation schemes that fed water to those terraces, would have extended natural vegetation distributions upslope. So the pre-colonial land use system would have significantly impacted the distribution of both plants and birds, because it would have altered the distribution of water in the landscape. So on one of the more spectacular aspects of the landscape were all these canyons. As soon as you leave the main valley, you inevitably have to go up through a canyon to get somewhere. And that is the main road, I believe, to Huancayo from Alice. But elsewhere, for those of you more interested in plants, you have slopes covered in lupins and a huge variety of other flowering plants. And it is quite spectacular. That, and on the top left, that's up at about 3,700 metres, 3,800 metres. And where the cacti are bottom left, that's obviously much, much lower. That's down at about 3,100 metres. And completely different birds live in those areas. One of the birds, of course, which you will all have heard of is the Andean Condor, which is declining across its whole range, including Chile, Argentina, and it has disappeared from Venezuela, and it's close to disappearing from Colombia and Ecuador. And in Peru, I think the last census revealed there were about 285 individuals left in Peru. We're not sure how they did that survey, because in the Cañete Valley alone, we think there's about 18 pairs. So that's a much bigger population than had been anticipated. But that's because we spent so much time there. And there are several places where there were 3 or 4 pairs of condors, then you could see them more or less every day. So that is quite an important part of describing the avifauna of the Cañete Valley. The realization that there is a significant population of them. And that is a further indication of the quality of the environment, the lack of contamination, and the lack of persecution from local people, and possibly also the existence of good populations of vicuña. And there are a lot of vicuña on the tops there as well, and that's probably what they are depending on to an extent. And then also throughout the Andes, you've got the great Inca finch, that's endemic to Peru. Coptic screech owl, that's only just been discovered in Loja in Ecuador, but it was previously considered to be endemic in Peru. And a wide variety of other species can be seen in the Andes, which makes for a very enjoyable visit for anyone who's interested in natural history and bird life in particular. And then, as I mentioned earlier, there are a lot of these relictual cloud forest or insular woodlands in the Cañete Valley, and rather more than you might imagine. As you go south along the Pacific slope from the Ecuadorian border, the areas of cloud forest and humid or semi-humid forest declines and becomes more patchy. Well, in the Cañete Valley, there's a sort of a bend in the river valley, which I guess traps moisture and makes it more humid. And so you've got quite large areas of forest there. This is inside the Reserva Paisajística no Coches Yauyos. This is the Bosque de Yoquia, which is a huge area of beautiful cloud forest. And as I say, since 2018, 2019, I believe we've seen precisely no one else there. Apart from local people, of course. But these hills on the left, the top left-hand picture, you can see actually in the hillside that actually that all used to be terraced as well. So this forest has recolonized what was a farmed hillside. And you can see the difference between the south-facing right-hand side and the north-facing left-hand side. The left-hand side is basically desert with nothing on it. The right-hand side is semi-humid. Well, that's probably a little bit strong, but it's more humid as a forest type, and it's very, very interesting from the point of view of bird distribution. And so it is. We found quite a few birds which are endangered. The one on the top right is a type of a warbling finch. This is endangered. It's found in, I think, 16 different sites only in Peru. The Piura chat tyrants only found on the Pacific slope of Peru, as is the bronze-tailed comet. and the black-necked woodpecker. They're all only found on the Pacific slope of Peru. And there's, as I say, there's another 17 of those only found on this slope of Peru. So once you start climbing up, one of the most interesting areas for us in the project was looking at the polylepis woodlands, the quenuales. So a really big focus of the study was to look at the polylepis woodlands. And a recent study looking at the polylepis in the whole of South America, on the Andes, found that the species of polylepis found in the valley is more or less endemic to the valley. This Polylepis flavicapilla. So you may not know this, but in fact there are 47 species, 45 species currently recognised for polylepis trees, not just one. And in the Cañete Valley there are probably 3 species, but this is the one that is most widely distributed. And here you can see it is, you see throughout them these red flowers. This is in fact mistletoe, type of mistletoe, Tristorix pubescens, and it is actually a parasitic plant, so it does eventually affect the health of the plant, and there are people studying how those plants impact the health of the forests. And we have found, looking at this, these forests, they're very widely distributed in the valley. There's more polylepis in this valley than any other valley on the Pacific slope. And quite a lot of them on the high ridges seem to be dying. So at the bottom left there you can see they're all brown, and walking along the ridges we found a lot of forests that just seem to be slowly drying out, which may be a product of climate change. We don't know. It's part of an ongoing study. But elsewhere in the valley where it's more sheltered, as in the top left picture, a little bit more mesic, a little more sheltered, these forests are still in very good condition with a thick understory and higher bird diversity as well. So in Peru, just to reiterate the point, so 45 species recognised, and there are 20 of them found in Peru, and 13 are only found in Peru. We've got 3 species in the Cañete Valley. The purple one is the one I mentioned, flavicapilla. So you can see it's more or less only in the valley. So you have quite a number of endemic species on the Pacific slope of Peru, but you have a species of tree, which is very extensive in distribution in the valley, which is only really found in the Cañete Valley and a couple of sites just outside it. And then 2 other species are really not very common. We haven't seen them mapped as occurring by Michael Kessler and Tatiana Boza Espinosa, after whom I've copied their map here. But you may have seen these forests. They're fantastic. They're sort of grove-like rather than wood or forest. They do grow up to 20 metres tall, and they're quite a magical sort of place. You can imagine Lord of the Rings being filmed there. You know, they're quite fantastic forests, all covered in moss and gnarled old trees, and some of them are probably several hundred years old. And in these forests, needless to say, there is another suite of endemic species. Top right is white-cheeked cotinga, which was discovered by Maria Kopka, and is considered to be vulnerable, mainly because these forests are either drying and disappearing or being cut for firewood. I think whereas the pre-colonial peoples managed the forest for a wood supply, now people don't bother. You know, they grow eucalyptus trees, and then if they want a bit of extra wood, they'll go and cut these down, which is a shame, really, because they don't regenerate. And so part of our interest in looking at this was to see how we could encourage people living in the headwaters to plant polylepis to protect the headwaters, to reduce erosion, to maintain the quality of water and reduce erosion. So most of the species that live in polylepis are near threatened. But also in the Cañete Valley, there is this species, bottom right. Perhaps no surprise it hasn't been discovered before, but because it looks a bit like a mouse with wings, but that has not yet been described. And so there is a new species to science in the valley as well. And although we've spent 6 months in the valley. It's a huge area. You know, there could be other new species there as well, of not only birds, but of course plants and insects. The other area of interest to us were the bofedales. You know, as I mentioned earlier, the Junín Huancavelica centre of endemicity, both for plants and birds, is absolutely crucial. And many of the critically endangered species and threatened species live only on the bofedales. And of course, bofedales, as you may have heard in the Cañete Part 1 talks, are crucial for reducing erosion, filtering water, absorbing trace metals, and not only maintaining biodiversity, but maintaining a resource for local people, because they use it for grazing. They have their alpacas on it and their llamas. Unfortunately, they now also put pigs on it, and sheep and horses and cows, which destroy it slowly. So we have in the Cañete Valley 3 very distinctive sorts of bofedales. You have the typical disticha peatland, which is top left. Then you have these stream grasslands to the right. They're very uncommon actually in Peru, but in the Cañete Valley there's a huge area of it which is pristine as far as I can see. And then you have the kind of peaty meadows, a rather more sort of marshy habitat with lots of grassland in it, but they each have their distinct bird species. And so in these valleys, these birds are really only associated with the bofedales. So top right, white-bellied cinclodies, there's a maximum of 250 left. They only live in the bofedales of Lima and Huancavelica, and they also go into Junín, but not very far. And diadem sandpiper plover likewise is only found on the bofedales. So you can see there's quite a wide variety of different species that are found throughout the valley, and that you know, a lot of tourists go to Peru to see the bird life. Well, they never go here, or we've never seen them anyway. And you know, you've got a beautiful landscape, fantastic wildlife, and amazing scenery as well. So it is very, very important for the conservation of a lot of these species and the habitats on which they depend. And as I say, the 2 habitats that we were most interested in really for the project were the bofedales, and we spent a lot of time looking at them, and also the polylepis woodlands and how they are being affected by climate change. So, and here we are. We have tried to map all the polylepis woodlands. So on the right, in purple, they are all the patches of polylepis. Now, if you look at the Santu Lalia Valley, which is just above Chosica, which is just above Lima, there's only 1 patch. We've mapped 195 patches in the Cañete Valley, so it's not as if there's a small difference. There's a massive difference. And so the Cañete Valley has a huge number of different forests throughout the valley. And what we've discovered is that these forests here in the landscape reserve are more humid. And these ones here on the west-facing pre-Cordilleras are much drier. And that is natural. And they do have different birds and different plants in them. They are different kinds of forests. These forests have thick understory with quite a variety of different other trees and shrubs in them. This often has Gynoxis and Buddleia in it. This doesn't. There's no Gynoxis here. It's almost entirely one species of tree. And this is where this new species of bird is. We don't know about the insects. We haven't got an insect expert in the team. But on the left-hand side, we've also mapped the distribution of bofedales. And again, there's a very, very high number of bofedales, all of which, of course, are very important for maintaining water quality for the population below. And they need monitoring and carefully looking after. So above all this, in the very high Andes, you have the ice fields and the Puna grasslands. So it's a fairly bleak place, and we didn't really spend a huge amount of time there. But you can see on the top left there, that's looking towards Colquepulcro from Alcampi. And on the right-hand side, that's a picture screenshotted from Google Earth. And that's what it looks like, apparently. We did go there. We spent some time there, and the ice sheets are disappearing quite quickly now. And so we didn't see a puma, but we saw plenty of footprints, so we know there are puma there, and plenty of vicuña in the high Andes, more or less along all the ridges on the watershed of the Cañete. I mean, back in the 1990s, there were none there. So they've recolonized really quickly. And following hot on their footsteps is the puma. And we haven't seen one, although Health and Safety at Cambridge, they discovered on Wikipedia that there were pumas in Peru. And so they insisted that we had an armed guard with us, just in case we'd be attacked by pumas. But I luckily persuaded them that wasn't necessary, because if we never see one, we never see it. But anyway, they were worried that we were going to be eaten by pumas. Other people were hoping we were going to be eaten by pumas. So in the grasslands, again, you have there's a hummingbird that only lives in the Junín Huancavelica Puna area in central Peru. You have to catch the light just right to see it, of course. The top left is a tinamou. Locally, they're called perdices, and evidently people like to eat them. And they're quite common throughout the high Andes as well. And so again, it has a good selection of endemic birds, so we will be publishing all our data. We've got a huge amount of data, of course, because we spent so much time there. And we have been looking at the polylepis woods and the bofedales especially, and looking at all the key focus of this part of the investigation was to look at all the endemic birds and the threatened birds, and the key birds found in those two habitats. We did spend time looking at the Lomas as well, and other habitats in the valley, but it's such a vast area we had to focus our attention. So I suppose what I can say is, even though we spent that amount of time there, I think we've probably made a useful start looking at the diversity in the valley. And we have mapped the key habitats, and we are now sort of looking at how we can map them more accurately using hyperspectral data. And we hope that we can use the publication that will come out of this work. This is all based on a publication that is nearly finished, to promote conservation in the valley and to draw attention to the need to maintain ecosystem services in the habitats in the Andes, to make sure that there will be chupe de camarones in the menu further down the valley in the future. So I hope you found that interesting and not too, haven't been going on too long, have I? Oh no, 8 minutes too long.
Yes, question, if you don't mind. Regarding the condor, any idea why they are declining in the neighbor countries? To say they are declining in Argentina?
They're declining because people are either poisoning them, because people insist that they kill their livestock, even though there's no proof that they look big, and they think, oh well, they must be killing my livestock, but they don't. So there's that, and then also changing agricultural practices. So whereas previously people would have farmed in a sort of extensive fashion with their llamas and alpacas, maybe the condors would get a few, whereas these days people have sheep and pigs and cattle and horses. They're much more careful. Okay. And also population is declining in the Andes. So people are leaving, going to Lima, going to Ayacucho. So many of these areas that you can see, there's no one there. I mean, I didn't deliberately take pictures where there weren't any people. There were never any people there. So, you know, there are many, there's many examples of evidence that people used to live in these areas. Old corrals, old drainage canals down the side of the bofedales. They used to manage the bofedales pre-colonial times to extend them. So they'd put irrigation canals down the side of the hills so that the bofedales would grow up the hills. So before colonial times, people managed this environment much more intensively. Worry, pre-Inca, yeah. I don't think the Incas just controlled everything. I don't think they really did much. The Worry were the ones who did the work, I think.
Will you go back again?
Sorry?
Go back again?
Will I go back again? What, here?
No.
I'm going back in 3 weeks' time. Yes, not here, not here. Actually, no, I am going back to Cañete. Yes, on my way to Ayacucho. Mm. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, you should. Well, you should go here.
As a child, do you think, God, all the things I must have seen and didn't really take me?
Absolutely. Well, this is a very interesting valley, not just for birds. I mean, I just happen to have been talking about birds.
In the first talk I gave last time, which is on the website, I think gives a broader overview of the valley and the variety of places that you might be interested in visiting. So that's on the website.
Somewhere you should definitely go is Carania, which doesn't have any forest as Machu Picchu does, but it is a settlement on a ridge like Machu Picchu, and it has similar terracing all the way down the hillside in exactly the same sort of landscape as Machu Picchu. And we've been there 4 or 5 times and we see no one there.
No. I mean, they're always opening up new areas for tourists.
They tried here, they tried, but yeah.
It's quite remote.
It's quite remote, but it's a stunning place. And it has those sort of circular areas they used to use for growing crops, experimenting with growing crops. What's that place called near Cusco? Moray. Like Moray, yeah. In fact, it's more complete than the Moray one. Yeah. Anyway, I suppose other questions for John and I about how on earth we managed to get to lark around in Peru?
How would I have to get to lark around in Peru?
Sorry?
I'm going there.
So how do you fund all of this?
So this is all funded. Right. So one of the reasons we can do this is John's been there 60 times to Peru probably. I've been 45 times. So we know people in Peru. And and we know how the government works maybe a bit. We have a lot of help from Julia and John. And so the funding all comes from Canon Minero, which is a tax, effectively a tax that the multinationals have to pay, mining companies have to pay to the government, and that money is then divided up by the community, hospitals, schools, roads, and finally universities for research. And so I think in 2015 or so, it was drawn to our attention that Peruvian universities were accumulating vast amounts of money and they didn't know how to use it. And we were the first university to go and make use of that money for the purpose for which it was intended, which was a collaborative research agreement with a foreign university. So we've done it 4 times now, and most other universities that have tried to do it haven't really succeeded in making it work. And I think mainly because they don't know Peru well enough, they don't know how the system works, and they haven't got the backing of a very wealthy university in the UK. So that's the answer to your question. Okay.
We would like to thank John and Eustace
Yes, come on,
for
John.
this very informative and fantastic presentation about the Cañete Valley. I'm sure we all have learned a lot today. And thank you very much also for your continued support to the Anglo-Peruvian Society.
Nice places to stay,
Yeah.
higher up. Yeah.
And thank you very much for coming over again
thank
and
you.
supporting the Anglo-Peruvian Society.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much, John.
It's a pleasure.